Yeah, what is going on with the Atlanta Dream? I gotta be honest, they're looking bad. They're looking real bad. And if you're looking at how they've been playing, they're a half a game ahead of the Fever. Or is it one game over the Fever? They lost 3 games in a row, and they didn't break 75 points in 2 of them.
Atlanta just lost to a team they had no business losing to. The Golden State Valkyries, an expansion franchise still finding its footing in its first real season of relevance, walked into State Farm Arena and walked out with a 78-75 win. For a team that's supposed to be a top 4 squad in the Eastern Conference, that's the kind of result that should set off alarm bells. And yet, here's the part that makes it more confusing instead of less. By almost every meaningful defensive metric, this Dream Team is genuinely elite. So what's actually going on in Atlanta? To understand why this season feels so contradictory, you have to go back to April, when the Dream made the single biggest move of the entire WNBA offseason. Atlanta sent 2 future first-round picks in 2027 and 2028 to the Chicago Sky in exchange for 2-time All-Star Angel Reese. It wasn't a minor transaction. It was a statement. Coming off a franchise-best 30-win season in 2025 under first-year head coach Karl Smesko, Atlanta wasn't content to just be good. They wanted to be a championship contender, and they were willing to mortgage future draft capital to get there. General manager Dan Padover called Reese a perfect fit for what the franchise was building. Smesko praised her versatility and her ability to create extra possessions. The fan base, understandably, was thrilled. Reese arrived in Atlanta with a resume that backed up all the hype. 23 years old, an all-star in both of her WNBA seasons, runner-up for Rookie of the Year in 2024, and a player who led the entire league in rebounding the season before the trade. She'd already broken records for consecutive double-doubles. She was, by almost any measure, one of the most dominant rebounders the sport had ever produced at her age. Pairing her with a core that already included Alicia Gray, Ryan Howard, Naz Hillman, Brianna Jones, and Jordan Canada looked, on paper, like the formula for a deep playoff run. And in a lot of ways, that formula is working. Atlanta currently sits among the top teams in the league defensively. They're forcing turnovers, controlling the glass, and Reese herself is second in the entire WNBA in total rebounds, trailing only Washington's Kiki Iriafen. The defensive identity Smesko built last season hasn't disappeared with a new star in the lineup. If anything, it's been reinforced. This is still fundamentally a team that can lock opponents down for stretches of a game. But here's where things get complicated. For all of Reese's individual brilliance on the boards, her offensive integration into the system has been rougher than anyone in Atlanta probably expected. Her scoring numbers are actually down compared to both of her seasons in Chicago. Her turnovers are up, and the advanced numbers paint an even more uncomfortable picture. Atlanta's offensive rating is significantly better when Reese is off the court than when she's on it. That's not the kind of split you want to see from a player your front office just traded 2 first-round picks to acquire. To be clear, this isn't a story about Reese being a bad player or a bad fit long-term. It's still relatively early in her time with a brand new system, a brand new set of teammates, and a different offensive structure than what she ran in Chicago. But early returns matter when you're trying to win now. And right now, the fit is a work in progress rather than a finished product. The frustrating part is that Reese isn't the only inconsistency on this roster. Atlanta's 2 veteran guards, Alicia Gray and Ryan Howard, have developed a pattern that should worry anyone paying close attention. Both of them have struggled to get going in first quarters this season, combining for a noticeably smaller scoring output in those opening minutes compared to the rest of the game. It's not that they disappear entirely, it's that the engine takes time to warm up. And in a league where games can be decided by single possession margins, a slow start can be the difference between control and chaos. Watch a few of Atlanta's recent games closely, and you'll see it. A quiet first quarter, a strong middle stretch, and then either a comfortable cushion or a frantic scramble, depending on how the third and fourth quarters shake out. That brings us to maybe the most concerning structural issue on this roster: the bench. Atlanta currently has the fewest bench minutes and the fewest bench points per game of any team in the WNBA. Gray, Howard, and Hillman are all logging minutes totals near the top of the entire league. That kind of workload is sustainable for a few weeks. It is not sustainable for an entire season that ends, if everything goes right, with a playoff run in late summer. When your stars are playing 35 minutes a night with almost no margin for rotation, fatigue becomes less of a risk and more of an inevitability. And fatigue in the fourth quarter, against teams that know how to exploit tired legs and slower rotations, is exactly the kind of thing that turns a 10-point lead into a 3-point loss.
Good teams have the dream beat this year. And I don't really even consider the Wings as in like top teams. You know what, Wings and Fever are okay. But they just lost to Seattle. Seattle. And like, I gotta give Angel Reese a bit of credit here because she's trying. Like, she was 1-6 to start the game and ended up going 3-0 for her next.
This isn't a new problem for this franchise either. Last season, before Reese ever arrived, Atlanta dealt with a version of the same issue. They held a lead in nearly every game they played, yet their fourth quarter defensive numbers fell off a cliff compared to their performance over the first 3 quarters. The same 2 names kept showing up in that conversation: Gray and Howard, both logging massive minutes, both seeing their individual defensive numbers spike in the final period. It's the kind of pattern that doesn't just go away because you added a star rebounder to the front court. If anything, it's a pattern that needs to be solved before this team can be taken seriously as a true title contender, because playoff opponents will find it and they will attack it relentlessly. So where does that leave Atlanta right now? Sitting in the upper half of the Eastern Conference, with a defense that can compete with anyone in the league, a superstar duo in Gray and Howard that can take over individual games, and a generational rebounder in Reese, who is still figuring out exactly how to fit into the machine. It's a team with all the raw materials for a deep playoff run, and also a team that just dropped a game it had no business losing, to a team it should be beating comfortably. 3 of Atlanta's next several games come against teams near the bottom of the standings, which gives Smesko and his staff a window to figure out rotations, get Reese more comfortable in the offense, and find minutes for a bench that's been almost entirely absent from the rotation so far. Beyond that stretch sits Indiana, the team that knocked Atlanta out of the playoffs last season in a series most people in Atlanta would rather forget. That matchup will tell us a lot more than a mid-season loss to an expansion team ever could. Here's the bigger question hanging over all of this. Atlanta's front office didn't just make a roster move when they traded for Angel Reese. They made a bet. They gave up 2 future first-round picks, assets that don't come back, on the belief that this current core, with Reese added to the mix, was capable of winning at a championship level right now. That's not a move you make if you're planning for a multi-year transition. That's a move you make when you think your window is open immediately. Which means every game like the Golden State loss carries a little extra weight. Every slow first quarter from Gray and Howard, every bench unit that can't hold a lead, every empty defensive possession in crunch time becomes part of a larger question the Dream front office is going to have to answer by the time the postseason actually arrives. Because here's the thing about aggressive trades like this one. They tend to be remembered in hindsight as either brilliant or reckless, and very rarely as anything in between. If Atlanta solves the rotation issues, gets its bench involved, and finds a version of the offense where Reese's gravity on the boards translates into easier looks for Gray and Howard instead of clogging up the paint, this team has the pieces to make a real run. The defense is already championship caliber, the talent is obviously there, but if the same problems that plagued this team last season, the same fourth quarter fade, the same over-reliance on a handful of exhausted stars carry over into the playoffs, then this trade is going to look very different in a year's time than it did the day it was announced. Let's actually walk through how this season has unfolded, because the story isn't just one bad loss to Golden State. It's a season full of wild swings that, when you line them up next to each other, start to look less like random variants and more like a pattern. The opener set the tone immediately. Atlanta hosted Las Vegas in front of a sellout crowd of more than 17,000 fans, and for most of the afternoon, it looked like a disaster in the making. The Dream found themselves down big, struggling to find any offensive rhythm, with Brianna Jones already sidelined recovering from a torn meniscus and Ryan Howard later forced out in concussion protocol. But then, midway through the fourth quarter, second-year guard Tahina Paupau drilled a corner three that brought the building back to life. Jordan Canada tracked down a loose ball off Aja Wilson's foot and turned it into a go-ahead layup. For one electric stretch, Atlanta had clawed all the way back and actually had the lead. Then, Las Vegas's Chelsea Gray calmly buried a step-back jumper with under 4 seconds left, and the Dream's stunning comeback fell just short, 85-84. It was a gut punch of an opener, but it also showed two things that would define the season. This team's defense and resilience could erase almost any deficit, and this team's execution in the most critical moments still had a long way to go. A few nights later, against Dallas, the same pattern showed up in reverse. Atlanta trailed entering the fourth quarter, then exploded for a 19-8 run to close the game out, with Gray hitting back-to-back threes and Canada delivering a near triple-double performance to seal it. That win pushed Atlanta to a perfect start. Then came a rocky rematch against Las Vegas, where the Dream fell behind by 19 points at one stretch, with multiple players in foul trouble, complicated further by missing both Howard and Jones to injury. Through it all, rookie Medina Okot, the 13th overall pick out of South Carolina, started flashing the kind of defensive instincts and finishing ability that made Atlanta's draft day decision to take the best player available look smart, even if her turnover numbers were still rough around the edges. By early June, Atlanta's offense started clicking in a way it hadn't all season. Against Washington, the Dream put up a season-high 109 points, their best offensive output of the year, built on 13 made threes, 32 made free throws, and a blistering 48.5% shooting night. Howard led the way with 19 points on 4 made threes, while Reese turned in one of her best individual performances of the season, 18 points on a perfect 10-for-10 night from the free throw line, plus a season-high 17 rebounds, 7 of them offensive, fueling 18 second-chance points for the team. Howard, meanwhile, was doing damage on both ends, leading the league in steals and racking up 6 takeaways of her own in that single game. It was the kind of complete performance Atlanta fans had been waiting to see ever since the Reese trade was announced. Just a few weeks later, the Dream got their first crack at Chicago, Reese's former team, and the moment carried obvious emotional weight. Reese delivered, finishing with 17 points and 17 rebounds in her first regular season meeting against the franchise that drafted her, with Howard matching her with 17 points of his own as Atlanta took care of business. There's also been a lighter side to this team's chemistry. During a post-game press conference after a win over Dallas, Reese and Howard traded jokes about nicknames they'd given each other, with Reese needling Howard about a minor social media dust-up from earlier in the year. It's a small moment, but it spoke to something real. Whatever the numbers say about offensive fit, the locker room chemistry between Atlanta's two biggest names appears to be exactly where the front office hoped it would be. Statistically, the numbers back up everything we've been describing. Atlanta is sitting in the top half of the league in net rating, anchored almost entirely by elite defense rather than offensive firepower. Their offensive rating actually ranks closer to the middle of the pack, while their defensive rating sits near the top 3 in the WNBA. That gap between the two is the clearest evidence yet that this is a team built to win with stops and rebounds first, and shot-making second. It also means every offensive slump, every cold shooting night from the bench gets magnified, because there's less margin for error than a more balanced offensive team would have. Health remains the other lingering storyline nobody's fully resolved. Brianna Jones, one of Atlanta's most important frontcourt veterans and a key piece of last season's success, has been out indefinitely with no firm return timeline, recovering from a meniscus injury overseas before the season even started. Her absence has forced Naz Hillman, last year's 6th Player of the Year, into the starting lineup earlier than planned, and it's part of the reason Atlanta's frontcourt rotation has looked like a moving target all season. Howard, for her part, has dealt with her own interruptions, including the concussion that knocked her out of the Las Vegas opener and forced her to miss additional time later in the year. When she's available, she's been arguably the best version of herself in her career, putting together a season-high 36-point outburst against Connecticut and averaging her best scoring numbers as a pro through her first several appearances. The problem is the word available. A core that includes Jones working back from injury and Howard managing recurring absences is a core that's never had the chance to fully show what it looks like at full strength for a long stretch.
There's also a financial dimension to all of this that's worth understanding, because it explains why Atlanta felt such urgency to make this trade in the first place. Heading into the season, the front office locked up nearly its entire core to multi-year extensions. Gray, Hillman, and Jones all signed deals running through 2028. Canada signed a 2-year contract. Howard, the centerpiece of the roster, is now signed long-term as well. In other words, this isn't a team built around expiring contracts and short-term flexibility, the way some rebuilding rosters are constructed. This is a team that has deliberately locked itself into this exact core for multiple seasons, which makes the front office's decision to also trade away 2 future first-round picks for Reese feel even more aggressive. There's no easy escape hatch here. Atlanta committed to this group and then doubled down by adding one of the league's most accomplished young stars on top of it. If this version of the team doesn't get over the hump, there isn't a quick reset button to hit. It's worth zooming out here because Atlanta's situation doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every contender in this league is making trade-offs right now. Some teams, like Indiana, built around a young core still on rookie-scale contracts, giving them flexibility to retool on the fly if things go sideways. Other teams, like Minnesota, have proven that continuity and system buy-in can outweigh star power on any given night. Atlanta chose a different path entirely. Lock in the core for years, then trade future assets for immediate star power. It's the kind of move that looks brilliant if the team wins a title in the next season or two, and looks questionable fast if it doesn't. There's no in-between outcome that makes everybody look smart. That's the tension sitting underneath every single Atlanta Dream game for the rest of the season. Let's also talk about what the bench situation actually looks like in practice, because the numbers alone don't tell the full story. Tahina Paopao has emerged as the most trusted reserve, logging more minutes than any other non-starter, but her scoring output has stayed modest, hovering in the high single digits per game. Medina Okat and Isabel Borlace round out the next tier of bench minutes, both averaging fewer than 5 points a night. That's not a knock on their talent so much as a reflection of how little runway Smesko has given his bench to actually find rhythm. When your starters are logging some of the highest minute totals in the entire league, your bench simply doesn't get the reps it needs to develop chemistry or confidence. It becomes a loop that feeds itself. The bench doesn't produce, so the staff trusts the bench less, so the bench plays fewer minutes, so the bench produces even less. Breaking that cycle before the playoffs isn't optional. It's probably the single most important adjustment this coaching staff can make over the next month. And then there's Reese's specific situation, which deserves a closer look than just pointing at her scoring average. She's currently posting fewer points and more turnovers per game than in either of her seasons in Chicago, but her usage rate, meaning how often plays are actually run through her, sits outside the league's top 30. Compare that to a high-usage, high-turnover guard like Caitlin Clark, who's also turning the ball over frequently, but doing so while touching the ball constantly as her team's primary engine.
Reese's turnovers are happening despite a relatively low share of offensive possessions running through her hands, which suggests these aren't necessarily aggressive playmaking mistakes. They look more like the rough edges of adjusting to a new system, new spacing, and new teammates who read the game differently than the one she played with in Chicago. That's a fixable problem. It's also a problem that takes time, and time is the one resource a team that just traded away 2 first-round picks doesn't have an unlimited supply of. So the real question isn't whether Atlanta has enough talent. They clearly do. The question is whether Karl Smesko and this coaching staff can solve the structural problems before the games start mattering most. Because right now, this is a team capable of beating anyone in the league on a given night, and also capable of losing to a last-place expansion squad on the next. That gap between their ceiling and their floor is the story of this Atlanta Dream season so far, and how it closes, one way or the other, is going to define whether that blockbuster trade for Angel Reese becomes the move that finally got Atlanta over the hump, or the one that haunts this front office for years to come. What do you think? Is this Atlanta Dream roster built for a real championship run, or is this another season where the talent doesn't translate into postseason results? Let me know down in the comments.